Hello everybody, well welcome to part 2, and today we're going to attempt to fit the rear shock. So before we begin, there's a few things you will need. Some Allen keys. We'll go through that in a minute actually, but I just want to give you some advice. So what I've done so far is I've tied the bike up, as I have a hook in the ceiling, as I use that when I change the tyres. And my first piece of advice to anybody is, if you are planning on fitting a rear shock, for the 3 or 4 days or even a week before the shock arrives in the post, I would advise you to put some penetrating oil in these 2 locations, because these bolts will be very hard to get out if you don't do that, or you might strip them and then you'll be stuck with that. So I did that. Now I've already turned both bolts with Allen keys. I was prepared to use the impact driver here, but I didn't need it. Now I've seen online people using all sorts of things like blow torches, heat up the bolts and all sorts of things, and mine just turned out with an Allen key. So what I'm going to do next, I've got a jack underneath, I've got it sitting on a paddock stand, and I've got it tied to a hook. Hopefully that'll be enough. So I'm going to remove these bolts and I'll check back with you in a second. Okay, so that wasn't a problem at all. So the first bolt, which was on pretty tight, but I managed to just spin that one out and that came out straight in easy. This one here, where people have a lot of problems with, because I've been dousing that in oil for a week now, I managed to turn that out with an Allen key. Now when you put an Allen key in here, you can only turn so far before you start hitting the foot rest bracket. But at that point, I managed to get a little socket into the end of it, or whatever that thing's called, this Allen socket thing. And then you can turn that with a 10mm spanner. And as you can see, that spins out. Now I was prepared that if that was not to work, I've seen people dismantle this whole bracket and take it off, and I didn't want to do that. I was going to see if it was possible to hitch the bike up, dropping that swing arm down past here, because it's not too far away, it's only a couple of inches away, as you can see under there, maybe just about. And I was prepared to do that, but I didn't have to. It literally pulled out like this. Was probably going to need a wiggle, but I think that's past the shock, so I will try and slip that out now. And yeah, and I'll get back to you in a second. Well, that was super easy. That came straight out. The only thing you have to pay attention to is there's a little washer that sits just behind here in the swing arm, and you need to, with a screwdriver, prise it forward in this direction and catch it with a pair of pointy pliers. And once you slip that out, this becomes loose in its mounting point. If I come over to here, you will have to you see mine's been swimming in oil because there's no drain hole here. This just, I'm surprised there's no hole there, because that will catch water when it rains or where you wash your bike, but it doesn't seem to be any damage in there. So yes, you slip that washer out from here, from this location here, and then the shock's just held in there. And what I had to do is just jack the bike up a little bit to create a bigger gap, and then it just pulls straight out. So I'm going to give this all a little clean, and I'll get back to you in a minute. Okay, that's all clean. I've given it a clean. If you can see in there, I'm not sure if that's worn away. It's too uniform. It looks like maybe it's machined to give it some space. I thought initially that was worn away by the end of the shock, but I've checked the shock and there's no worn marks on there, so maybe they've just given it a bit more space. Anyway, that's all clean, ready to go. Just want to show you the shock now. If you look at the shock, you can see, if you look here, this is a flat edge, and you see here it's chamfered. So this is the outside, so it sits in the bike in this position. So you get a nicer looking edge on this side, and the sort of, whatever that would be, the fill hole will be hidden round the back. Now if you remember last time, with that lock-in grommet, when that sits on the bike, it goes here. Now if you notice on mine is around the back. So I'm going to take it out from around the back and pop it into the front, so should I need to turn the ring, I can get to it easily from that side. So I'll swap that round now, and next time I see you, this will be in position ready to be bolted. Well, there it is installed, and doesn't it look great? I think that's amazing. Right, so a couple of things. Right, this bolt to get back in is quite straightforward, and to torque it down, the manual over there says 42 Newton meters, so that's easy to get to. Now to get that bolt in, you have to play around with the jack in order to line up the hole, because right, where do we begin explaining this? Right, if you don't remove the foot peg, in order to get this bolt back inside, you have to play around with the height of the bike in order to snake it around and go in. In the back of these footrests, there are recesses. And if you get the bike at the right height, the bolt can sit in the recess, the head of the bolt, and then you can snake it in and start hand tightening this bolt here. But this won't line up. So once you've done that, you then have to either drop the bike slightly or raise the bike. I think it was raise the bike in this case, to line this one up. And then that just pops in. Now, like I said, 42 Newton meters is very easy to do on this bolt, but unless you have some tool which I don't know about, you can't do this. So what I did is the usual. Paid attention to the force required to tighten this up to 42, and applied the same here. That's going to be good enough. It's tight. If this starts to come out, you will see it way before it exits this hole. Just keep an eye on it. But 42, it's you know, it's a good tight feeling. It's not you're not torquing a wheel nut. So that's done. So then that's that. So the only other thing, the bushing on this supplied shock, there's no washer required. It's ever so slightly too wide to fit into that hole. So I decided to, very easy, took less than 1 minute, was to crack open the belt sander, and I masking taped everything up here, and literally 30 seconds on the belt sander, paying attention to keeping it square. It's soft aluminium, just skimmed probably less than a millimeter, but it saves you having to hammer that into that hole, and I don't think you will get it in the hole. Just to point that out. Maybe it's just this shock, maybe someone else has come across the same thing. Very easy to do. I wouldn't let that put you off. And the very last thing was the measurements. So I did the same measurements, and funny enough, the bike sits on the ground, or on the paddock stand, at exactly the same height as I measured yesterday. It sags when I sit on the bike exactly the same as I did yesterday. The only difference is the sag of the bike itself, which I think they call the pre-sag, has gone up from, I think it was 5 millimeters, and it's now 10. So what I will be doing is I will be just adding a bit of preload to bring that sag down. So when I sit on the bike, it won't drop as much as before. So I'll do that now and see if I had a result. Okay, I've done that. I've wound 1 full turn of extra preload onto the shock. I've measured my mark and it seems to be 3 or 4 millimeters less the seat drops with me sat on it. So I'm going to leave it like that. One other piece of advice is when you loosen the grommet to do any adjustment, take the grommet out, because unless you do full turns you will not end up in the same place, obviously, and you might have to grab the other hole. So just bear that in mind. So there it is. I'm going to go for a little spin on it and see how it feels, and maybe if anyone's interested I'll report back in a few months of how I've got on with that. Okay, I think that's about it. What do you think? Okay, well, I'm back again. Just a little extra, just a few observations, and I thought it's worth mentioning. All right, so I've just been for a ride, and it's excellent. There is a difference. It's too early. I only did 4 or 5 miles, but I can already tell. How would you describe it? Plush. If you know the roads, you know the bumps. It's not as jarring already, so I think it's going to be a success. So that's that. So it's too early to tell. We'll report back in a month or so about that. But one observation that's worth mentioning, I just realised on this fitting here, on the new shock, the shoulders are quite thick, because on the original one, if you remember or if you can see, it's more of a pressed steel, and on this it's a cast aluminium or machined. I think that's cast. So this ends up being thicker, and I've just snaked my finger around the back to the hex nut on the back and realised that bolt doesn't really come all the way through. It's definitely caught the bolt, but it's probably only halfway through, and that's not good enough. So you will need a longer bolt. I mean, I will have to order one, because all I have that would fit is a stainless steel bolt, and that will look dreadful stuck in there. So I'll probably have to either file or machine the end, but ideally you'd want one in black, I imagine. And I think you need a 50mm bolt. It's a number 10, 50mm with a nut to go on the back, the lock nut. That was what I was trying to think about. The lock nut to go on the back. So it's a number 10, it's 50mm, but something prettier than that. So it's another trip on eBay. But anyway, that bolt is not long enough, and I imagine that that's the case with most replacement shocks, because most replacement shocks have this type of cap. And I have noticed on videos that some suppliers of different shocks supply a new bolt, and now I realise why that would be. YSS does not. Anyway, that's that.